When a sequel as good as Chaos Child comes out, I have to worry. Not only for its sake, but for the sake of its predecessor. On its own, it's a masterpiece. One that should absolutely be looked at regardless of one's investment in the science adventure franchise as a whole, thanks to its relatively loose connections to past material. But that's not something obvious from the outside. On the other hand, there's the fear that it may further make the already somewhat shaky ground Chaos Head stands on look even more unstable. It has its problems, and with many, if not all of them, being addressed or lessened in Chaos Child, then its value to its future installments may be thrown into question. That said, perhaps I'm just deluding myself so that I can trick my brain into finding an excuse to talk about these very interesting visual novels. And who am I to argue? My mind is the master. Or is that just what it wants me to think? If the title alone wasn't enough of a sign that Chaos Child was iterative, then making it all the more clear is its main character Takuru's given name being a syllable off of Takumi, the respective nicknames of Taku having been given to them by a pink-haired main girl, and the functionally identical mechanic of delusion triggers where the characters escape into their fantasies, the player choosing its nature. The comparability of their delusions is actually quite fascinating, as while they both tend to imagine the best in the form of erotic scenarios, and the worst in the form of much more grisly ones, this is merely an observation on surface similarities, not mindful of the more intrinsic differences between the two as characters that the delusions, sprung from their minds, echo and represent. Loneliness and social anxiety are both prime attributes to both characters, but are manifested in different forms. Takumi might insist otherwise, but he's borderline hikikomori, only leaving his domicile to shop, go to school as infrequently as possible while still being able to graduate, informed by an elaborate schedule so he can skip as much as he can, or go to a net cafe to play the same games he does at home, just in a fresh environment. He's a person who's most interested in spending his time on the simple pleasures of an otaku rather than doing anything requiring direct engagement with people. In a sense, he does not exist socially out of the school and internet. And though Takumi prefers it that way, there is a lie in Takumi's outward dismissal of social life. While he might claim he's satisfied with his way of living, when opportunity knocks, he finds himself enthralled by any female who pays attention to him, his lack of skill in social situations making him an easier mark than he would admit. His positive delusions result in ideal outcomes, often erotic, while his negative ones have him retreating to the worst-case scenario, feeding his paranoia, and thus the social anxiety that keeps him away from people in the first place. The sudden interest so many girls take in him allows ample opportunity for both best and worst, but he can't know which until he engages. Takuru, however, has a different form of separation from those around him. He has no trouble attending or participating in school, being the head of the newspaper club. He has several friends, though despite being surrounded by pretty girls, he is about as likely to get a girlfriend as Takumi. So, though his delusions similarly evoke both erotic ideal and horrific disaster, Takuru's delusions often make use of his strangely specific knowledge. The articles written for the out-of-print Cool Cat Press magazine lead to erotic scenes and serve as a tool of ridicule in the more pessimistic delusions. And given that it's a source of knowledge so few others have, there's a level of pride Takuru has in taking that knowledge despite its dubious quality. Other specific knowledges that work their way into his delusions might be exotic teas, old man hunting, or fujoshi interests and culture. The desire to have knowledge is at the core of Takuru's character, and his prime desire for possessing that knowledge is esteem, the satisfaction in being right, the ability to share that knowledge while quietly claiming a sense of superiority to silently lord over others. He sees himself as above the girlfriend-crazed normals, yet to look at him through the lens of the player, we see that he's barely better than the otaku trash that is Takumi. Whereas Takumi isolates himself physically and desires human contact, but is too weak to seek it out, Takuru isolates himself mentally by putting others down out of a desire for recognition and justification in having learned what knowledge he knows in the first place. These delusions are not merely what he would like to happen, or what he most fears, but those ideal scenarios stem from his desire for vindication in what he does know, while the knowledge he takes in also expands the scope of possibilities when it comes to things going wrong. It is his desire to be in the right that ironically separates him from those who he needs to give him that justification. Comparatively, Takumi's delusion triggers have a likelihood to go into the ridiculous bizarre as Takuru's do, but even more often they are notably toned down. Some delusion triggers aren't full cutaways, but instead inform Takumi's mental response. One early trigger has Takumi facing evidence that the girl who suddenly fell in love with him may have been following him before they first spoke. The positive trigger has him dismissing the connection, trying to ignore that something is wrong. Ignoring the trigger has Takumi starting to suspect something before getting slapped away from the suspicious bag, while in the negative delusion he becomes suspicious, attributing the strange happenings to the new-gen killings. But these smaller, more reserved moments of Takumi expressing his mood or inward thinking through the player's choice also further characterize him in comparison to Takuru. Takaru has no subtle, small delusion triggers. Either the trigger is ignored by the player, or he imagines something dramatic, something interesting, something big. The only player-controlled delusions to step outside of the typical eye cutaway and colored border is a scene where Takaru is still practicing with his telekinetic powers. Takaru's abilities stem from the same power of imagination that all psychics draw from, thus the connection to the delusion triggers. But in imagining something large in scale, it again reflects Takaru's desire for wider recognition and interesting happenings. He chases the return of new-gen killings, whereas Takumi wanted nothing to do with the original murders. His higher tendency for smaller delusions compared to Takaru similarly matches desire to stay small and avoid interaction with the world at large. Whereas a small, positive delusion of Takaru's might have a girl showing him some sudden romantic interest, or involve him successfully bribing his perceptive and worrisome sister with sweets to the point that she cries, Takumi might imagine himself just being able to have a normal conversation with a girl, or being recognized by his childhood doctor. The delusions in the cases of both characters, through being so personal to them, still evoke their mental states, and the small differences serve to properly contextualize their individual stories rather than serve as excess matter. The difference in scale surrounding the hopes and expectations of the two characters is one further exemplified in their connection to the story and its intended horror elements. Conflict is achieved when something counter to intent and desire interrupts. Takumi is awkward and prefers being alone, so the events of the story place him front and center. The murders and conspiracy gripping Shibuya circle around him, inevitably driving unwanted others in his direction. An incident at a skyscraper pushes him to the status of a minor celebrity, giving him a recognition he never wanted or asked for. And when it leads to ridicule and harassment, it only further drives home why. While Takumi wants peace and quiet, the events of the game are large in scale, eventually shaking Shibuya to its core. And this forms an interesting contrast when viewed with how Chaos Child iterates upon this, as Chaos Child deals in the repercussions of the events of Chaos Head. The quieter echoes to the bombastic climax of the earlier game result in events not caused by the machinations of leaders in a grand conspiracy, but the equivalent to janitors and middlemen still cleaning up after the mess, leaving Takaru's goals as small and misguided in the relatively insignificant scheme of things. Where this pressure extends to the horror elements, Takumi has his fears realized in the form of outward intrusions of others into his reserved personal life, while Takaru has his fears evoked when, in a way, he gets exactly what he wants. Everything ties together to story, character, and atmosphere alike, resulting in two distinct stories despite the same mechanics, similar premise, and roughly the same setting. The meaningful difference in scale also extends to perhaps the biggest divergence Chaos Head has, not just from Chaos Child, but from the rest of the franchise and how it handles its side cast. From Steins Gate onward, the supporting characters were by and large in the same group, with similar goals and reasons to stick with the main protagonist. By having the characters together often, it allows for more interactions and scenes with which to further flesh them out. But this is not the case for Chaos Head. Again, Takumi remains isolated often by his own desire, the other characters entering and leaving his life as the story demands. While it fits the tone of the game, it leads to less screen time for the side characters, and thus a much less memorable cast overall. Yua, for instance, outside of her interactions with Takumi, is only ever seen either alone or with the detectives looking into the case, not having a single meaningful interaction with any of the other 5 leading ladies. With her amount of character moments limited to her personal conflict, interactions with Takumi, and her assistance to the case, it results in a character who is rather two-dimensional, though not quite 2D enough for Takumi's taste. Further exacerbating the issue is the lack of character-specific endings that were added in the expanded re-release of Chaos Head Noah, which would serve to give more attention to the side cast. Through Takumi's seclusion, the variety of scenarios we see this side cast in is left wanting, and they suffer for it as a result, even as much as Takumi's character and the overall atmosphere of Chaos Head benefit for that seclusion. This difference may be one of Chaos Head's more notable flaws, but it also feeds into its most striking and unique qualities when placed next to other entries in the franchise. In tandem with its rather imaginative use of delusion triggers and player agency to add to the atmosphere, Chaos Head remains as an interesting and memorable, if flawed, experience as a whole. And that's the takeaway I'm hoping for. Chaos Child is stellar. I avoided talking about the specifics here as many of them are best experienced for yourself, and I will have more to say in the very near future. Chaos Child may be ultimately better, but while Chaos Head suffers from the lackluster sidecast, over-expositive science babble that's honestly kinda dumb, and lower production quality, it still has enough matter of its own to offer, and for that I still think it's worth a look. If you only play one of them, play Chaos Child. While it is a sequel to not 1 but 3 games, the connections are small, and with Chaos Head specifically, there's deliberate misinformation and vagueness when past events are brought up, the developers leaving the first game largely unspoiled for those who wish to go back. Or you could miss out completely, not play any of them, and just watch my future videos on the franchise anyway. We're not all paid to do this. Thanks to my patrons such as Mohammed, Garrison Dunn, Peter Cairns, Volkion, and Mathwiz for making videos like this possible, and I will see you in the next one.